Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India as well with me, Frank Rousing Pereira. Prime Minister Narendra Modi was accorded a rousing welcome on Sunday when he arrived at the crowded NSG Stadium to address the Indian-American community along with US President Donald Trump. The mega event witnessed leaders of the two largest democracies, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Trump, sharing a stage before the largest gathering ever, over 50,000 Indian Americans for an elected foreign leader visiting the United States. Organized by the non-profit Texas India Forum, the event with the tagline Shared Dreams, Bright Futures brought to light the tremendous contribution of Indo-Americans in the United States and the strong and lasting partnership between the US and India. Ahead of Prime Minister Modi's address, the Indian-American artists from Texas and elsewhere performed cultural programs. On this edition of India as well, we will analyze the Howdy Modi event and the contribution of the Indian Diaspora. Joining me on the program today are Professor Swaran Singh, School of International Studies, JNU, Pramit-Pal Chaudhary, Foreign Affairs Editor, Hindustan Times, and Meera Shankar, former ambassador. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. As far as the Howdy Modi event was concerned, what were the key takeaways for you?
Well, the key takeaways, I think, are one, that the Indian-American community has certainly come of age. It not only is one of the most educated and most wealthy communities, but is increasingly taking a very active role in the politics of the United States. And we see the impact of that in the fact that President Trump agreed to come and address the gathering. Now, partly this is about Indo-American relations, but even more so about President Trump's domestic constituency and how this outreach to the Indian-American community will play in his favor in the forthcoming presidential election in the United States. So that's one key takeaway. The second, of course, is that both countries appear to be on the same page as far as countering terrorism is concerned and as far as enhancing border security is concerned. Finally, I think in the field of economics and trade cooperation, where there have been tensions between the two countries, we didn't find much of an echo of that in President Trump's speech. It was more a question of how this is a partnership where India is the most reliable ally or friend, not ally, but friend of the United States, and how the two countries can work together for the future. The tax cuts which were made by the present government shortly on the eve of Prime Minister Modi's visits were welcomed by President Trump, and also other measures to ease red tape. And of course, I think for Prime Minister Modi, the fact that, this in a sense overshadows any kind of negative fallout of Pakistani campaigning on the Kashmir issue is clearly an intended outcome.
Absolutely.
So overall, I would say it's been one which reinforces the relationship and underlines the strength of the Indian-American community in the United States.
Absolutely. Talking about the Indo-American community, Pramit, as far as the domestic constituency, like the ambassador was talking about, as far as Trump is concerned, do you believe that addressing or going to this Indo-American event was purely a political agenda as far as Trump is concerned? Because, we've known that the Indian community in the United States in the past have voted en masse for the Democrats. So is he trying to turn that around?
Yeah, I don't think he expects the Indian-American community to change its political affiliations. They vote roughly 70 to 80% in favor of the Democrats. But there is a little bit that in terms of funding, it can often be as close as 50-50. During the Bush years, for example, partly because George Bush did so much for us, I had Republican Party officials say that they believed at that point at least the money coming in from the Indian American community, and they're very wealthy, was almost evenly split between the two sides. No, I think for Trump it's a much larger thing. He needs, he's now heading right into his re-election campaign. In effect, he will be a lame duck president by December, once the New Year Christmas period begins. February, the Iowa caucus will officially kick off the presidential campaign. Right now, he's looking at two problems. One, the U.S. U.S. economy is almost certainly going to start to slip into a mild recession by the beginning of next year. So he will effectively run into the single strongest point he has with the electorate, which is that you've had 4 years of immense prosperity because the U.S. economy has been booming this past 4 years. That's going to slowly disappear. Second problem that he faces is that he desperately needs a success on the foreign policy side. He hasn't had any. He's had a number of tough positions that he's taken regarding Iran and China, but it hasn't really netted him anything so far. He's taken a hard position on trade, and he's gotten a rebadging of NAFTA and a few other things. But he doesn't have too many things. And one of the reasons I think that you're seeing India and the US are trying really hard to come to at least a small trade agreement is because he needs something. And trade is number one in his foreign policy agenda. He wants various agreements, whether it's with India or other countries, between now and December. Finally, just keep in mind, to be able to address a rally of 50,000 people in the United States is big for any American politician. Literally no American politician can come up with numbers like that, including President Trump himself. So for any gathering of 50,000, you will automatically get a lot of American politicians very interested in showing up. And if you saw the congressmen who came in, they were a mixture of Republicans, Democrats, governors, senators, all of the House members, all of them wanting to show up because of this. You may remember when Modi had done a similar event in England, where he had 80,000 people in Wembley Stadium. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, came to there. And Cameron said, I can't get a crowd like this. I want Modi to come and campaign with me when I go around England. So that's the kind of star power he has. But in a democracy in particular, just the fact that you can bring 50,000 people from across the United States to come and listen to you automatically means people want to rub shoulders with you.
Absolutely. All right. So that having been said, Professor, what does it say about the Indo-American community as a whole?
Obviously, such a large gathering and American president standing next to Indian Prime Minister enhances their confidence. They are already very upwardly mobile community in United States, but that gives them a little legitimacy or little sanction of belonging to a powerful country in that sense. So that is boosting their morale in that sense, but also boosting the morale of both leaders who were addressing in such a large gathering, as Parmit just said. Basically, we are still talking of Donald Trump moving into his election campaign early next year. And if we notice, he was not getting any success either in cutting a deal with the Chinese or cutting a deal with Taliban. So he has to really look for something as a takeaway for his election campaign. And therefore, I think it's a great opportunity to engage a leader like Prime Minister Modi, who can get such a large gathering. And in that sense, project that as a success of a relationship. And we are still talking of some kind of a mini deal being finalized before Prime Minister returns home. And therefore, I think it's partly driven by Prime Minister's own global stature rising and President Trump's also local orientation towards elections. As for India-United States relations, I think it also highlights that again, talking about future opportunities, two democracies, and how people will be the drivers of future in that sense. And Indians in United States are mostly professionals. They are known for being really professional people, not really the business people as the Chinese would be, for example. So in that sense, a very important constituency, about 32 lakh people there. And also the fact that he had been to New York, Washington before, and of course to San Francisco, where you have a hub of Indian people, and now Houston, which again has about, I think, 1.2 lakh people in Houston area itself. So where is Indian community located also partly determined. And finally, quick point about the hub of energy production which Texas is. and how India has successfully moved in procuring gas and oil from United States, and that is how we have been able to cut down to zero our imports from Iran in that sense. So I think multiple drivers to why the venue was a choice, why the two decided to stand together and address such a large gathering. And finally, I think it's symbolisms basically which also promotes India's global visibility, and hopefully Prime Minister will get much better press this time when he addresses the United Nations General Assembly. And I think that is also a clear takeaway from such a large gathering happening in Houston.
All right. Ambassador, since we're talking about drivers and influencers, how influential has the Indian diaspora in the United States been, and what is the potential as far as the Indian diaspora that is concerned?
Look, it's not a very large diaspora if you look at it in terms as a percentage of the overall American population. The Chinese, I think, are the largest Asian immigrant community, then the Filipinos and so on. So India is, but it's the quality of the immigration from India. Most made their way through scholarships in the 70s and 80s, and then later as foreign education was opened up, I think a large number of Indian students go there, and that becomes a primary route to settling in the United States. So they are highly talented, highly educated. You know, whenever I went to any university in the United States, there I would have an automatic constituency because all their management studies departments, all their economics departments, all their mathematics departments, many of their engineering departments, all had so many non-resident Indians as professors, deans, heads of department, and so on, all across the United States. Secondly, it's a community which is well accepted. If, you know, there used to be a glass ceiling, and to some extent there still is, but many have been able to break through it. So if you look at the CEOs, you know, whether it was Indra Nui or whether it is, you know, Mr. Banga of MasterCard or, you know, Satya Nadella or Pichai, you know, you have so many CEOs of what I would call the top iconic US companies, which are absolutely their top, who are or have been of Indian origin, Indian Americans coming from India, many first generation immigrants to the United States. And their leadership in these iconic companies was accepted, and they are seen as drivers of prosperity and good management in those companies. Thirdly, I would say that the Indian Americans, particularly in the Silicon Valley, have been a key part of the innovation system in the United States. When you said that many are not really in business, actually the small high-tech businesses in the Silicon Valley and the, you know, Bay Area have really been seeded and funded by Indians. So they've not been in small businesses, you know, to the extent that the Chinese have, but at the cutting edge of innovation and, you know, smart technology companies. The Indians have been, Indian Americans have been a force for innovation. Now, all that having been said, I think really Houston, as the professor said, was an important place because it's a hub of energy. And also to some extent digital. I mean, Texas Instruments is based there, and you have all the big and small energy companies based there. And that's going to be one of the key areas for Indo-US cooperation, both in the field of import of oil, import of gas, which enables us to, in a sense, overcome the vulnerabilities and vagaries of supplies from the Gulf, which is facing geopolitical, geostrategic turbulence, which will continue for some time. And on the other hand, I think it also gives us an opportunity to look at stronger cooperation in the field of renewables, because you know, for India, reducing the footprint of fossil fuel is also an important objective, along with energy security. And here I would like to stress actually that you know, the Americans pushed us to remove the local value addition norms that were part of our initial policy and lower tariffs on imports. And at that time, I had told them that, look, it's a matter of principle, but at the end of the day, neither you nor India will benefit from it. Most of the sales will go to China because their, export of panels and all is highly subsidized. And that's exactly what happened. What I would like to see now is some investment from the Americans, technology companies in India, in manufacture of solar energy and wind energy equipment, because that is where we still have a huge gap.
Absolutely, absolutely. Pramit, that having been said, and since we're talking about energy and energy security needs, can Texas be the answer to India's energy security in the days to come?
Well, as has been mentioned, we are importing very large amounts of oil, natural gas really, and starting to import oil from the United States. And Texas, interestingly enough, while it is the hydrocarbon hub of the United States, is also one of the biggest sources for solar and wind investment and technology. It's after California, it's really the #2 state in that sector as well. So yes, we're looking at a mixture of different flows. On the renewable side, we're looking mainly at finance because 60% of the cost of solar power ultimately comes from the financing end of it. We're looking at the possibility of what can be done in areas like electrical vehicles and other very ambitious plans that the government has. So that's there, but it's going to be largely, in my view, a financial story. It's going to be about whether American finance is going to be able to provide the impetus for renewables, because renewables in the initial phase will continue to be a financially questionable area until it matures as a sector. And we can see that already in India and solar, where investment is already starting to drop off because the returns on solar power have been weak. But the real issue, I think, is going to be baseload power. Like, what is solar and all of that is very good, but it's not going to drive a steel mill. So you need really big power stuff coming in. Baseload power continues to be in India largely coal. We're trying to gasify, which is why America is important, not only because of the supply of gas, which you can get gas from many other parts of the world, but America's huge production of shale gas has driven global prices down. It's the primary, it is literally the single largest reason why gas prices have collapsed globally. At one point, we used to pay as much as $14 to $15 MMBTU for our natural gas. Today, Henry Hub prices, which is a dominant price in America, are $3, $4 MMBTU. So we can thank the Americans for having driven that price down. They've also stabilized oil prices, despite Venezuela being off the table, Iran being off the table, half of Libyan production normally in question, OPEC having slashed production by 5%, you still have seen oil prices remain remarkably low. And one of the key reasons, in fact, the overwhelming reason, is that almost 60% of all the new oil production in the world in the past 5 years has come from the United States.
Right.
So you have that, but I think the next step is going to have to be, we'll have to go back again to nuclear power. We're still trying to get over the liability issues. I think that's largely resolved. Then Toshiba Westinghouse's bankruptcy proceedings are now over. And from what I've heard, the Indian government, US government will hope to start to begin the purchase of nuclear reactors, which are now actually no longer really American. They're owned by a Canadian firm, but a lot of the technology remains American. And we'll probably see that come back to life sometime at the end of this year, early next year.
Okay, all right. Professor, when we talk of Howdy Modi, shared dreams and bright futures, let's focus on the shared dreams bit now. What are these shared dreams? What is it that we'd like to see doing together and collaborating further on?
I think to continue with energy first, that itself is a major responsibility, climate change mitigation and reducing the carbon footprint. And therefore not just finance, but I think technology in both increasing efficiency, transmission lines and other usage, and also conservation and making the energy sources widespread in that sense. And likewise also spreading the suppliers of India, from where we procure. So instead of being excessively dependent on Gulf region, which is in a turmoil, as Madam Ambassador just said, to diversifying the sources of suppliers. So in both technology and supplies, I think that diversification would ensure that we are able to first of all reduce the carbon footprint, which is I think an important issue for both United States and India. Now, other than I think the enormous focus on dealing with terrorism, and that was also emphasized in the speech from both sides. And I think in that sense, this also partly answers what India wants to say vis-a-vis Pakistan. So you see India and United States kind of standing together. Though of course partly triggered by the fact that Taliban conversation has been stopped between United States and Taliban. So Pakistan is no longer as important as it was before. And of course, other than terrorism, I think democracy itself, the idea is to spread that potent democracies are a good way of conducting decision making in nations, has I think some reflection on China indirectly therefore. And you will notice that the Quad, after long years of reluctance of India, has finally been upgraded, and I think foreign ministers of these 4 countries are meeting on the sidelines. So India is in that sense very carefully calibrating after long reluctance to make sure China and Russia as part of the Indo-Pacific discourses, and are now saying that Quad and Indo-Pacific are not the same, and therefore we are willing to upgrade the quadrilateral of democracies to begin to talk at foreign ministers level. So in that sense, it's a gradual inching together with each other of both United States and India, and that is a good drift in that sense, because lately India was also being bracketed back again with Pakistan, and India, Pakistan were becoming kind of a issue for world over.
Right.
To now being bracketed with the United States is I think a good drift for India's diplomacy to work in that direction.
All right. Closing comments now from all my guests, in fact, about the Howdy Modi event, of course, and as well as the way forward for both India and the United States. Starting first with the Ambassador.
Well, the Howdy Modi event underscores that the relationship is not merely between governments. The US and India have a very broad-based relationship. One is the relationship between governments, which is good, and where, both parties, Democrats and Republicans in the US, have been seeking closer relations with India. It's a non-controversial issue in the United States. Secondly is the relationship business to business and the economic relationship, which could grow faster. It's been not as robust as it could have been. It's growing. It's our biggest market for India and one of the largest sources of investment, largest source of technology, largest source of financial collaborations for Indian companies. But I think it could be more robust, and I do hope that we do see a small trade deal between India and the United States, right, resolving some of the issues which have been kind of bedeviling the relationship over the last several years. There's some talk that India could agree to, say, for instance, open up imports of pork, cherries, some agricultural products from the United States, maybe do something on medical devices, and perhaps in return for that, the US might reinstitute GSP, the Generalized Scheme of Preferences, reduce duties for Indian exports.
Right.
So if that works out, I think it'll be a good thing, because it will put behind us, some of these issues which have been cropping up actually for now almost, the second term of the Obama administration and the Trump administration, which has made this a priority.
Sure.
And in that sense, it would be good for the relationship too, overall, the strategic relationship, because at some level, otherwise there's this thing that, India is not flexible, doesn't know how to actually reach consensus or to give, basically. So I think that puts kind of an end to that.
Absolutely.
Overall, I think the relationship is on a good trajectory. And clearly, whatever hesitations the two countries had in strengthening it or coming closer, we seem to be overcoming those and moving ahead much faster.
Right. Ramit?
America, I think the Prime Minister Modi is very clear in his mind that America is overwhelmingly his most important bilateral relationship. America's, in terms of the foreign investment that it makes, the foreign portfolio investment, the technology, much larger than any other single country. And it is thanks to America, even countries like Japan are coming to us because it has been Washington that has encouraged them to do so, or even working with countries like Israel. On the security side, again, all of the cutting edge weaponry that we are going to be needing in the future is going to either be partly American. I mean, even if you buy a Swedish fighter, it's 40% American. You buy an Israeli drone, it's 35% American. Strategically, whatever we wish to do, whether in terms of isolating Pakistan, soft balancing against China, maintaining the Indian posture in the Indian Ocean, again, America is the most important country in all of these issues. So the only area, literally the only area, in my conversations with the government have made it clear, the only area where they have seen a serious problem with the Trump administration has been trade. And that's partly because of President Trump's personal obsession with this. And that's why I think when you saw what Modi is doing now, reaching out to Trump, making him feel happy, and then being able to get him soften up a situation where he can get a small trade deal that will ease this key obstacle to the relationship. I think that he's playing his cards very well. He's realized that stroking Trump's ego, showing his domestic support, all of these are what you need to do to get Trump interested in you. What's interesting about the Trump administration is that the Pentagon, the State Department, the intelligence agencies, Congress have had almost no problems with India.
Right.
There's a complete consensus, Democrat, Republican, and so on. It's only been the vagaries of the president that are the only thing we've had to worry about. And I think that's why he's been addressing it directly with Howdy Modi.
Okay, all right, Professor?
In fact, Prime Minister himself answered that question, Howdy Modi. And he answered that I am fine in 6 languages. And I think that should bring some relief to this whole debate that we have on Hindi as the national language. But more important, I think, is his distinction today. Indian Prime Minister perhaps is the only world leader who has such a relationship with Donald Trump. Donald Trump has had difficulties with all other world leaders, and to bring that kind of projection of bonhomie, I think, is a success in itself. And Indian community in United States that had anxieties about the whole debate on immigrants and how Trump had spoken about them. And this, I think, brings in a whole new vision of that relationship and should bring enormous relief to the Indian community in United States. And finally, I think it's also setting an entirely new benchmark of how Indian Prime Minister travels abroad. The number of meetings that you notice and the size of this meeting sets an enormously new higher benchmark of how Indian Prime Minister engages when he's traveling abroad. And I think now it will be the task for diplomats to see where to go next and what to do next. So it actually throws up a challenge for diplomats in coming times.
Okay, all right. On that note then, we'll call it a wrap to this edition of India's World. I'd like to thank my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me, but we'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your feedback with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. See you again next time.